Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the latest BCS author webinar on AI ethics, where we will be looking in particular at some of the key lessons from getting started with tech ethics, written by well, basically a number of the authors of the book will be joining us as speakers today to take us through some of the coverage and also some of the key messages that have been provided through the book. Obviously, understanding a lot of this is very relevant to how AI is showing up in our everyday lives, and in fact, that's making it more relevant than ever at this particular time. This webinar is being recorded, just so everybody knows, and will be posted to the YouTube playlist for the author webinar series once we're done. It's normally done within about a week of finishing the video, but it can be done within a couple of days depending on resources at BCS Towers. We do have a really strong backlist of YouTube videos available there, so please do enjoy them. And we are planning for the next set of BCS author webinars for next year. So very open to any requests, but we will be also promoting new books and key authors as relevant to market needs. There will be a Q&A opportunity for this webinar as well, so please do think of your best questions. If you can post them in the Q&A function, if you can see that, I will start with a post there so everybody is able to see it. But if you can't find it, then please do use the chat and I will try and facilitate those questions later in any case. Yeah, so that's basically all of the housekeeping that I've got to do. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Neil Gordon, who will provide us an intro. Just so you know, you are currently on mute there, Neil.
Thanks, Ian. Welcome, everyone. Nice to be here today with you all and with the team who helped work with me on the book. So I thought it was an important topic for British Society and for tech professionals, both in the UK and beyond. I think we've seen the impact of IT around us, the growing concerns around AI, and it's really critical that as we build solutions, as we recommend systems, as we use IT ourselves, we think about this ethical aspect. So this book reflects that. We'll talk more about it, go through the chapters. So it's nice to be able to introduce most of the team who are here on the meeting today. I'll go around the team and explain my own role and some of the colleagues will talk about themselves. So I'm a professor in computer science here at the University of Hull. I've been involved with ethics in computing for a couple of decades now, in both teaching and in industry practice as well. I've been involved with the British Society's Ethics Specialist Group for a few years. I've been chairing that in the last 2 years or so. I've been looking at a lot of ethical aspects. So it's really positive to be approached by the BCS about this book, about if we're interested in developing it. And it was a good chance to talk to colleagues within the Ethics Specialist Group, some of whom are here, and other colleagues that we've engaged with and met over the last few years around ethics in IT. So I'll get each of the authors who are here to introduce themselves. The one missing person here is Gillian Arnold, but she co-wrote the chapter, and we've got Tripp who'll explain his role later on as well. And then we'll go through the book sort of chapter by chapter, basically exploring what it's about, what the chapters focus on, and hopefully be something that you'll all find useful as a way to help you wrestle with the challenges we all face in tech ethics. So I'll just go around the authors in the list from the contributions on this page. So say, unfortunately, it's a Jill Cat with us today, but so the first person who is here is Darren. So Darren, just give a brief overview of yourself.
Okay, thank you. I'm a professor in strategic project management at Lancaster University Management School. I started in computing. I've been collecting failures for 35 years, which is kind of why I'm here. I developed an interest in why systems fail and have continued to try and make sense of those failures, hence this journey. Thanks.
Okay, next it's Catherine.
Hi, yes, I'm Catherine Flick. I'm Professor of Ethics and Games Technology at the University of Staffordshire in Stoke-on-Trent. And yeah, I'm basically an emerging technologies ethicist, and I've been specializing more recently in games, but I have a general history in looking at the ethics of emerging technologies, and I do a lot of media and outreach work on games and AI and all those sorts of fun things, crypto, stuff like that. But I've been more recently obviously getting into the game side of things because I think that's where a lot of emerging technologies sort of have a bit of a test bed. So it's interesting to see what might be coming out next, sort of thing. So yeah, that's my where I am.
Thanks, Catherine. And next then we've got Bernd.
Hello, my name is Bernd Stahl. I'm Professor of Critical Research and Technology at the School of Computer Science at the University of Nottingham. I've been doing ethics and technology for quite a while, and in Nottingham I lead a research group called Responsible Digital Futures, where we're trying to get our heads around where is this all going to go and what do we actually want from technology and how do we make sure it is more beneficial than damaging.
Thanks, Bernd. And then the next, Robert.
Hi, I'm Professor of absolutely nothing at all. I'm in the gang because I've spent the last 45 years working mostly in banks, in IT departments, getting systems built or trying to get them built, or then working out why we failed to get them built, or wondering what's happened when we had built them. And so Catherine, Gillian and I were more around the real world side of trying to cope with these ethical ideas.
Thanks, Robert. Yeah, so Gillian can't be here. She's been very proactive around issues around EDI and computing. She did a previous book with BCS on that topic of sort of gender balance in computing. And so I'll be very proactive in the BCS itself, sort of former president. So Gillian was a big push on the book overall and the chapter she shared with Robert Ilko later on. So that's kind of overview of the team. Again, we'll share some links at the end of the meeting chat for our LinkedIn profiles of information. And obviously a chance in the Q&A. If you've got questions for anyone based on the specialisms, do make a note now and ask us when it comes to the Q&A part. So move on to the next part of the presentation. Thank you, Ian. So the book itself is a sort of single book. It's divided into chapters, and to aid us in kind of managing how we contributed to it, we did split those. So essentially each contributor focused on one or two chapters, but then we did look at that as a sort of cohesive story and explanation. It's something where you can just dip in and out of a chapter potentially on a particular topic that might be relevant to your context or of interest to you. Equally, it explains how it flows from chapter to chapter if you get and reading through the book. So obviously the book has that sort of traditional introduction, gives an overview and explains some of the rationale to that. One examples in the introduction, which really had a big impact on me, I think is the Horizon scandal. I'd used it in teaching for many years as an example of IT systems gone wrong. But again, there's the ethics specialist group. About a year and a half ago, we were on a workshop in London on learning from the Horizon scandal, and we had Lee Castleton from the former postmaster came and spoke about his experiences, and it's really sort of emotive to hear the impact of an IT system that had gone wrong on people. And I think that's really a driving force, certainly for me, in why ethics is so important. I mean, to think about the impact of our systems on people. So we opened the introduction with kind of some of the context of the book and that idea of why we did it and about how the book is structured and hopefully how people can use it. So the book itself is intended to be a user guide series for BCS. So whether your role, whether it's a early career in IT, if you're established, if you're senior in an organisation, ICO in an organisation, also for students and academics, it's intended as a resource which covers several dimensions of ethical computing. So I'll go briefly through the structure of these chapters and then hand over to the individual contributors for their chapters. So the introduction I covered goes on to then just kind of the foundations of tech ethics, which Bernd explains in his chapter. Then looking at more professional behaviour at the individual level, which Darren explains, and then building up on that into the ideas of how that affects organisations. It's going to Robert and Gillian, bringing in particularly their commercial experience and practices they've seen. It goes on to the wider impact of that in society with Bernd again, and then looking at some of the broader impact of that around sustainability and ethics. Again, with things that I've been interested in for, again, a couple of decades. And then linking back in chapter 7, as Catherine mentioned in her self-introduction, I know she's very keen on is this area about emerging technologies and about how we can navigate that as we new ethical challenges we're seeing. Again, AI is a good example of that. And then we close in the future directions chapter, which is looking around some areas where the reader can think about how they might progress dealing with ethics in their context. It's talking about some of the ways individual CPD might work, some of the frameworks people might use, and other links to progress forward. So with any kind of ethical literature, anything ethical book, it's a user guide and practice, as a series is intended to be, but equally it recognises that our ethical practice will evolve over time as we meet different challenges. I think the book is there as a guide to help people with that. So that's the overall book structure and kind of ethos. We then go through the sort of chapter by chapter then. So the next slide, please, Ian. So say we open up in the introduction to the book. The intention was, as I say, to contextualise the issue of ethics. Sometimes people complain that ethics is too philosophical, it's too abstract. Or equally in case studies, it can become too lost in dealing with the issue sometimes. So we try to have a book which explains ethics in real world scenarios and issues. So looking at things like I mentioned already, the Horizon scandal, how IT systems can do. It's interesting as a teacher, I discuss these case studies with my students, and it's often quite illuminating when you ask them, in this situation, what would you do? And I was teaching actually last week on ethics and computing. I asked my class if you asked to build an IT system and told about some requirement you have to do, that sounds a bit strange, but you have to do it, how many would simply do it? And in that class, the majority, about 95%, said they would just do it and forget about it. Only 1 or 2 said they'd question it. No one said they wouldn't do it. Again, it's understanding the impact of these systems. So that's what we're trying to build up in here. So the introduction explain why it matters, how our tech now is so integral to so many parts of our lives, but our tech decisions are affecting society, how people can just miss these blind spots, or sometimes just walk on past them, ignore them. So we try and build some real world case studies and frameworks and ways we can reflect on it in practice. As I say, the book is designed for a wide range of audience. So whether you're a developer, designer, manager, if you're new to the area, if you're a student, hopefully it will be something in there which will help you. And it's grounded in that accessible framework so that anyone can use it. But it does link into some of the wider ideas around ethics and how to apply it in practice. So that's the kind of introduction. And on to the next slide, and I'll hand over to Bernd.
Right. So my first chapter here is around why does it matter? And I guess I'm preaching to the converted here because you're all here and you probably think it matters. I think the headline answer to why it matters is, of course, all the various anecdotes we've come across, all the many high-profile issues. And I've just spent the last 20 seconds looking at the BBC Tech page, And you could pretty much fit all of what's up there, from visitors to Pornhub to child sex dolls to security. All of this has an ethical component to it, right? And we're all aware of that, and it's a big topic. It pervades our lives. It's something we can't ignore. Why do we need to write a book about it? And I think the question here is, what does an IT professional, somebody who's a BCS member or who aspires to be a BCS member, what do they need to know? And so we've tried to write this bit in a way that it makes sense to professionals who work in a professional context. And one of the things that requires is what I've called here intellectual rigor. So it's all good and well to discuss these topics in a pub, but we want to go beyond that. We want to make sure that people understand the basis. There are thousands of years of history of ethical debate. Not all of that you need to know in detail, but it is important to understand roughly what the trajectory is and what sort of arguments are out there. The overall reason why we're worried about ethics, certainly from a professional context, is that it helps to avoid harms. So we know these AI systems, IT systems more broadly, can create harms. It is an ethical requirement or obligation of professionals to think about those harms and try to mitigate them where possible. So there is sort of a risk management component to this. It aims ethics, or thinking about ethics, has one of the consequences of mitigating risks and dealing with immediate harms. And I think most professionals are reasonably happy with that. But I think that it's important to think beyond that. And that's where we think about broader societal issues. So what does technology actually do to the way we live our lives, to the options we have, to how we engage with the world? And that's something I'll come back to in my second chapter. So we need to understand where we stand. We need to understand as individual professionals, but also collectively, what are the norms, what are the values, what are the principles upon which we want to act. These may be consistent, they may be contradictory, we may have individual contradictions, we may have different views across society, but we need to be able to understand those, to be able to work through them and find reasonable solutions. So it is thinking about ethics in emerging technologies, in information technologies, in AI, is something that has to inform professionals in the way that they interact with the rest of the world. Professionals have a key role. They're certainly not the only ones who have a role to play in this, but they have a key role in identifying, understanding what the problems are, and finding ways forward and finding solutions. And I think that's, to me, a key reason why a BCS member should think about these things and should think about it not just on a superficial level, but try to think it through in a bit more detail than you would do in a pub. Thank you. Next chapter.
Okay, thank you very much. My chapter continues to focus on professional ethics, or the professionals and how they apply ethics. And the first question that we really want to address is, do we have a problem with ethics? And I think some of the stats can help us with that. So I see the first one has popped up. So this is based on the study by the Institute for Business Ethics. It's a survey of results in 8 European countries, and it says on average, 70% of respondents say that their organizations always or frequently act with honesty. 22% are not convinced. The numbers vary slightly from 69% in Germany to 88% in Ireland, but typically just over 3/4 of us feel that the organizations act with honesty. Next bullet point, please. In the UK, 67% of respondents, of employees, feel that they would speak up about misconduct. They would say something about it. The biggest difference in Portugal, for example, this was closer to 49%. Next bullet point, please. Yet, 1/3 of all respondents are actually aware of misconduct at work. So they've experienced it, with 46% recognizing that people have been treated unethically, 35% identifying misrepresented hours worked being reported, and 30% reporting safety violations or not reporting them as you're supposed to. Next bullet point, please. Critically, 16% of people, of all respondents, felt a pressure to compromise their ethical standards for all kinds of reasons, and we'll come back to that in a moment. And finally, one more bullet point, and in a slightly different survey, the 2020 Global Business Ethics Survey, 79% of US participants and 61% of global employees had experienced retaliation for raising ethical issues. So it's fine to say, I want to do something about it, but 80%, almost 80%, 4 in 5 of us in the US and 60% across the world had experienced some retaliation. So the obvious question is, why do we act unethically? Next slide, please. And before we actually jump to the points, I can encourage you to put, so this is another survey. This is a 2024 Ethics at Work survey with 12,000 participants. And before I actually reveal the answers, maybe I could encourage you to put something in the chat. Why do you think people act unethically? So anything you see, that your first thing that comes to mind, why would you act unethically? And I'm going to share the top 10 reasons in a second, but I'll give you a minute or so, or a couple of seconds, just to put your top answer. Personal gain, money, okay. Any other reasons? More money, keep the job, profit. No surprises so far. So whilst you're doing that, let's share the results for bad actors. So the number one answer was, not too surprising perhaps, I was following orders. I was just being told to do it. The next one is time pressure. Next one is be a team player. People are also asked to take shortcuts because we need to. Quite a few were trying to save their job. Some have noticed that we're under-resourced and therefore we have to do this. Unrealistic business objectives. Helping the organization to perform better featured as well. Financial and budgeting pressures, and my organization has an unethical culture. So these are the top 10 answers, and they point to, next bullet, please, next slide, please. So they're suggesting that so far I've shared the bad and the ugly. I did say I started by collecting failures, so I'm quite fascinated by how things go wrong. But let's try and finish on a more professional note. We've started by talking about professionals in the previous chapter. So in this chapter, we talk about professionalisms and why we turn to professionals. And it's obviously to do with trust. It's to do with the security, knowing that we have experts in place. And it's the comfort that comes from knowing that. Part of what we do as professionals, we develop code of ethics, and there's discussion about how we develop them and what applies. And some of the minimal, perhaps some of the indications of what we should be thinking about is an obligation to technical, managerial, and moral competence, and an acknowledgement when we don't know something, an obligation to present and review evidence honestly without bias, an obligation to timely communication of all results, good and bad, an obligation perhaps to voice concerns and speak truth to power in ethical dilemmas, recognizing that there might be a problem, acceptance of responsibility for action, impacts and consequences, with some of the comments we've seen on the previous two slides notwithstanding, an obligation to limit harms and ensure safety of products, systems and outcomes, and an obligation to guard the interest of multiple stakeholders and parties. Perhaps one of the biggest challenges, because we have conflicting needs, conflicting interests, and we need to keep an eye on all of them and look after a wider set of concerns from societal to environmental to sustainable and other considerations. So thank you very much. I'll stop now.
Hi. So the chapter that Jill and I put together was building on the previous two, where we've had a kind of a frame of reference for ethics, what they mean, what are normative ethics. Then we've talked a bit about, in the previous chapter, some of the professional obligations that we've just been hearing about. As a member of a profession, you're obliged to do things. So IT professionals work in an organizational context. Typically, there might be a software company, or there might be an IT department. There'll be a leadership team, and you could be a member of that, or you could be part of the leadership team. And some of the difficulties that we've been seeing, should we have a look at the first bullet point? We've seen, IT departments are accountable. Eventually, if something goes wrong, everyone looks at the department and said, well, how on earth did that happen? So there is an accountability, albeit it's not obvious necessarily up front. Next. And the result of being accountable is things can go wrong, and you can damage your brand, as we heard with the post office case. In my line of work, which is more to do with financial services, TSB famously managed to get themselves onto the BBC for doing an implementation that went tremendously wrong. And then as that was uncovered, it was discovered there were all sorts of compromises caused by some of the symptoms that we saw from about 2 slides ago, in terms of pressure to cut timescales and to take risks with testing and so on. And then there's also the whole employee well-being. So Google famously got into a bit of a tiz around some of its ability to cope with ethnic diversity or not in its workforce. So these are next slide. The reasons why we need to be thinking about these problems in the organization. So it's not just us as individuals, but it's in the organization that we work in. And what we're looking for are next, avoiding some of these kind of experiments. Next. So these are some of the things that we've just been seeing. And finally, we can help. So given that problem, what can BCS do? Well, at the profession level, we can provide a code of conduct. That doesn't sound much, but it gives you a right to say, my professional code obliges me to think about these things. I can't just do as I'm told. The other support that you could look for an IT professional is from your IT leadership team. So what would the leadership team provide me, and what should I be campaigning for from the leadership team? Can we have a look at the next slide? So the next point. So there are kind of 4 things that we think leadership should be able to offer, no matter how small the department. First, they can start behaving. They can start being sympathetic to someone who says, I'm having a problem with this. They can develop a code of ethics for the department. They could take the BCS code, they could take the American code, or they could take, there are a variety of starting points. There'll probably be one for the entire organization in many companies. But you need to make it mean something in IT. So things like, I don't know, respect for the customer or respect for diversity. What does that mean? It could mean that you're thinking about, how do I build systems which have got an opt-out for those that cannot work with digital technology, people that are blind or illiterate? How are we going to support them in this greater project? So within the IT code of ethics, you take some general one and you internalize it to your department. And that can be something that can come from the bottom upwards. You can start working on it as an individual and start circulating it as a good idea, or it can come from the top and be supported. Next. We can just interject along the project lifecycle various interventions, little checkpoints at project gateways. Does what we're doing do harm? Have we left anybody behind? Moral questions that we can ask in the same way as we would do is, have we remembered audits requirements? Have we remembered access for online complying with various cues for the visually impaired? We just inject some moral questions through our development life cycle. And finally, we can create a little board or committee. This sounds a bit grand, but really it's just a group that we could use to try and discuss problems and make recommendations. If we're getting a common pattern, because of the nature of the industry working in my world, mostly financial services, huge amount to do with how understandable are these complex financial products? What can we do to make it easier to improve financial literacy? Quite a common practice. Every time you launch a new product or put out a new campaign or create a new channel using some form of technology, how can we make it digestible and understandable? Quite a common pattern. So an IT board or committee thinks about some of these things and can come up with some departmental or organizational approaches. I think that's about it, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's back over to me. What we've heard so far was very much focused on the individual. And of course, a professional is always an individual, and we make our decisions on an individual basis. But we also do this in a social context. We are influenced by the world around us. Traditionally, ethics is also very much focused on the individual. So the subject of responsibility typically tends to be the individual human being. So the reason why we suggested, or we put this chapter in here, was just to highlight that it's not just all about the individual. So if you want to understand what the individual does and how the individual does it, you need to understand the broader context. You need to understand the societal aspects of this. So this is important for various different reasons. On the one hand, ethics, to a significant extent, is a social enterprise. So what we believe to be right and wrong, so our moral preferences and beliefs are very much shaped by the world around us. We could have a long discussion on the philosophical ethics of that, but I think to a significant extent we would probably agree that there are moral preferences that apply to societies, to groups. So they shape what we think is right and wrong. And I think it's also important to understand or reflect on and be aware of the fact that professionalism itself is a social enterprise. So professions are social groups that get certain privileges from society for or in return for services rendered to society. So this is about protection of the individual. For us as computer scientists, it is about making sure that the computers actually work, that they're safe, that they have consequences that are desirable. So the whole idea of professionalism is one that is embedded in the greater good for society, and that's why professionalism works. Now, computer science professionalism in computing is not quite at the same status as you would have in law or medicine, but we certainly have a certain level of professionalism, and the principles apply there as well. So it is about having the public good in mind. Next slide, please. It is therefore important to think about what are broader social questions that are worth discussing or being aware of. And a key one that drives a lot of the other concerns we may have is the economic embedding and the current business models of digital technologies. So if you look at the world stock market, of the 7 largest companies, of the 7 companies that had a $1 trillion valuation on the stock market last time I checked, which was a couple of months ago, I think it's probably still true, 6 of them were IT companies, right? The IT industry is utterly dominant at this point, and it can dictate to a large extent what we can do and what we cannot do. And that has, so it has an economic power that is pretty much unprecedented for most of human history. This raises questions, lots of different questions. Those include questions such as unemployment coming through. AI in particular is what people are worried about. But it also has raises questions around who owns what, who has the say over what, on what grounds. And in many cases, the structures that we see have the potential to alleviate problems, to make things better, to reduce inequality, to reduce injustice. But in practice, they often do the opposite. They entrench existing problems even further. And surveillance capitalism is a term that was coined by Shoshana Zuboff, which describes how current business models incentivize companies to collect data in ways that are not necessarily conducive to our well-being, but which helps the companies increase their profits, which raises questions around how we as societies define business models and what we find permissible and not. So there's the whole economic side. There's also a very big political side to this discussion. So how does technology, how do modern information technologies influence political power, and how do they change how we make decisions? So we've seen various examples of manipulation of elections facilitated through technology. There is this whole issue around fake news, which is now at the point where, of course, it's very difficult to distinguish whether anything is news at all and whether it's fake or not. Then you have the confluence of the economic power and political influence, which again changes the way power distribution is provided in a society. And then just being aware that you may be surveyed has consequences on us, which are well established. So people talk about the chilling effect. So just because we think we may be looked at by the state, by powerful actors, we may change our behaviors, which may affect all sorts of things, including our human rights. And then the final point I would make, which is already implied in what I said earlier, is that our agencies as human beings change. So we act according to what we think is possible. And arguably, modern technologies shape what we think is possible significantly. So modern technology makes things possible that were unthinkable only half a decade or half a century ago. So we can call somebody in Australia or South America, and it doesn't even cost us anything. So we have opportunities which are really unimagined in the history of humanity. But at the same time, it may also constrain what we think we can do, what we think we cannot do. And often this gets forgotten, this doesn't get looked at, but it may have significant ethical implications, even though we're not necessarily always aware of that. Over to the next presenter.
Thanks, Bernd. That nicely dovetails into my chapter looking at more the sort of global IT, ethics, and sustainability. So, as Ben was saying, we're in a context where we can do things now that were unimaginable 50 years ago. The IT industry itself is a global industry with that global impact. Again, you see that twofold. We depend now on platforms, services from other parts of the world, and the things we do, things we create, can have impacts in other parts of the world. So the idea of hardware, software, and services now sort of transcending traditional political and geopolitical boundaries. So one of the things I've drawn in my chapter here is looking at some of the positive and negative aspects of computing, and in particular how that aligns with what's quite known as green computing, but more broadly sustainable computing. So in the chapter, I explore a little bit around how those concepts often are perceived as different. I know for green computing tends to be more the environmental side of computing, which is really important, but equally it's not always it's not the only or most important part of computing. It's impact on society and its potential to again change that global world in particular. So that's how I align it with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and can be a way to help frame things we might do or think to contribute to where we can in our own roles, whether at work or voluntary work or other things. So the next part, Ian, please. So again, these illustrate some of those issues. So the global data centers, we're using the movement of data across boundaries, and the energy required to run that, and the water is becoming quite a significant aspect as well. So there's a environmental impact we see. In my chapter also includes some case studies, examples of the good and bad of computing. The middle picture here is still small, but it's one from, I think it's a Greenpeace shared repository, but of some of the problems being faced in many African countries in disposing of our waste electrical computing devices. So again, it's that notion that where we have laws and things intend to be beneficial from an environmental perspective, like the WE laws for Europe, and obviously the UK still adheres to that, but in other parts of the world, there are similar ways to try and regulate and control waste within a country. But that waste then goes somewhere, and we're seeing that in some parts of Africa now, where there's mass pollution problems being caused by them trying to dispose of cheaply the waste that we've created. So this issue that computing is a global factor in many ways. Next slide, please, Ian. So we'd look at that, was thinking as to how we could align it with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Again, in the early chapters, colleagues explore some of the approach to ethics, things that drive our personal ethics. For me, that's when I came across a couple of decades ago, was the idea of sustainability and United Nations approach to that as a way to maybe identify some common areas where, regardless of socio-economic, religious, political boundaries, globally there's agreement on things that need addressing. And these goals give us a way into that. Things like no poverty, tackling hunger, tackling environmental problems, tackling good use of technology and science, the things that these goals illustrate. So in the chapter, I've gone through the 17 goals and how they can be linked with different aspects of computing. We're seeing that the same things like AI now, creating these new pressures, the thing that powers it, the energy, the water, and the labour, another aspect, means that now AI is putting pressures on society globally. It's causing potential damage. Hopefully what we see is that the benefits it gives us outweigh that. Again, the image here was created by an AI system. I did ask it to withdraw this picture to have the benefits outweighing the challenges, but it refused to. So I'm not sure if that's an implicit knowledge the AI system had or whatever, but it would draw it one way, and I keep on saying, well, no, draw it this other way instead. And it kept on refusing to. But I hope that we can show that AI is more beneficial than detrimental. And that's looking forward for that. And other technologies we have, we'll see some of the challenges with things like quantum computing. Again, immense energy requirements, many questions about how it works. You think about these broader impacts of it. So the SDGs are a way to frame some of that. I go my own work in research. I'll encourage you to work on projects which can help some of these areas like health, education, and food as well. So hopefully the chapter will give you some insights into my perspective on this and how that can maybe give you a way to frame some ethical choices you might make in the future. Thanks, Ian. On to the next.
Right, so I think like with all these chapters, they kind of, work well together. And one of the things that I was thinking about when I came to writing this chapter was about the fact that there's a lot of people are quite worried about the influence that big tech companies in particular have on our lives. And we're seeing a lot more of these companies basically going in with pretty much an abject disregard for societal impacts. And a lot of people are starting to get kind of worried about it, but they're not really sure what they can do about that. And so I was thinking about that while I was writing this chapter. And actually, I remembered a paper that Bernd and I wrote a really, really long time ago, where we looked at emerging issues, emerging technology, ethical issues. And I went back to that and looked at how these issues actually are really still the same. And they have been really similar issues over a really long time throughout technology. And the big thing about this chapter is it shows that these issues don't really change very much, but the context in which they are applied, or the how they're used, the definitions that are involved, these do change over time. So some of the big issues that have been that have been an issue for a really long time is essentially like the lack of understanding of non-technical people about technology. So, I mean, we see this very much, this is sort of the conceptual issues, and this comes out of Jim Moore, if you follow the kind of classic literature in this. He had this concept, this idea of conceptual muddles, where it's very, very hard for us to kind of understand what everybody else is talking about when they say, for example, AI. Like, what is AI? It's had lots of definitions at the moment, and what it does is it kind of, there's this lack of understanding the concepts that are being used and how people are using them kind of covers up a lot of the potential harm that can come from these, and how they're being implemented, and what they're being used for, and what sort of data they, how they work, all these sorts of things. And this also then adds into the ability for these companies to build this kind of like hype cycle around this stuff. So we've seen a lot of hype cycles recently, most recently obviously with AI, generative AI more generally. But we've seen them also for things like cryptocurrency, and the next sort of stage, I guess, is probably this quantum computing, right? Everything is quantum, but what is quantum, right? I mean, it's these are basically kind of buzzwords that are used to hide what the actual real technologies are underneath, which may not necessarily live up to the hype that's being built about them. And I mean, we've had issues of privacy and security for a really long time. These are still issues that happen with emerging technologies. I mean, we see, like Bernd was talking about, the surveillance capitalism. You know, privacy back in the 1980s was about making sure your server rooms were locked. These days, it's a lot more complex in terms of security, and things like how we treat people, who has you know, sort of the dominant voices in society. These are all issues that have kind of been coming along with who is it that actually works on these technologies, right? And the inherent power differentials that come, you know, between people who have technology and don't have technology, how people are treated by that technology. So what sort of biases, what sort of, you know, built-in prejudices might they have? People, you know, the other emerging issues that we have, and we've seen this a lot with sort of recent AI stuff, is the fact that people are concerned about their own autonomy. People want to be able to make decisions about how they live their lives, and they want those to be kind of transparent. They want, and if decisions are made about themselves, you know, whether they get a credit card or whether they get a house, or, you know, in terms of like a loan for a house or something like that, they want those to be kind of like transparent and open and able to be understood. But we're seeing those sorts of decisions and becoming much more opaque, and we're seeing a loss of human autonomy as a result of that. And that's even before we get to the kind of, you know, technology replacing humans in jobs, which further decreases overall societal, you know, individual autonomy as well. In terms of responsibility, these are issues that have been happening for a long time as well. There's a lot of discussions about responsibility, what that actually means, but in my chapter I sort of just have it as a fairly simple, who's actually responsible when something goes wrong? And with kind of a lot of these more complex systems, it becomes very, very difficult to nail down who, like what happened, if something goes wrong, who's actually responsible. And I mean, systems are becoming even more complex, and now we have machines making decisions, like who's actually ultimately responsible for that. And then there's this whole issue to do with uncertainty of outcomes. And we've seen that certainly with these hype cycles, that there's a lot of predictions about what could happen in the future, and a lot of those are very shiny, rosy ones that, you know, attract a lot of investment. But actually, when it comes to the, you know, when push comes to shove, what they actually return is not necessarily what was promised to begin with. And now we've had several cycles of this. People are not really sure about how new technologies are going to impact them. And we see a lot of uncertainty around what these outcomes of these new technologies is going to be. How are people going to be impacted? And I think this is further compounded by the fact that a lot of big tech companies just don't actually seem to care anymore. They seem to be a little bit too big to, you know, be reprimanded for, you know, trampling over people's rights, or, you know, harming people. And so we have a lot of conflict now within the big, like the way that society interacts with technology. And I think one of the key things, coming back to these kind of the fact that I was looking at big companies, I was thinking, so one of my other hats that I wear is I helped to rewrite the Association of Computing Machinery's Code of Ethics a few years back. And one of the big things that we struggled with was the fact that, you know, as a professional organization, you can really only look after individual members, right? And individual members can sign up to a code of ethics, but a lot of the people that actually do sign up to codes of ethics don't often have a lot of agency within their own jobs. And you know, they're not the people making decisions at the top. They're the people who are doing the day-to-day work. And I've been thinking about that a lot since then. And one of the things I wanted to really drive home in my chapter was that, yeah, a lot of these sorts of things that you're required to do by codes of ethics, or asked to do by codes of ethics, or by societal expectation, or whatever, these can be really, like, these are not necessarily going to be the sorts of responsibilities that you have. And so what can you actually do as an individual who just kind of does the day-to-day coding, doesn't have necessarily that sort of decision-making power? So next slide, please. So I was thinking, about what can you do even if you can't do anything else, right? So if you're in this situation where you're working on an emerging technology and you're worried about what might be happening with that, you might be. The thing about working on emerging technologies is that as you're at the cutting edge, you're actually probably in one of the better positions to be able to see what the future impacts might be of the technology that you're creating. So I think that it's a really powerful position to be in, even if you can't necessarily affect anything in terms of the decision making within the company that you're in. But I think it's really important to as an individual, there are some things that you can still do, right? So you can keep up to date on discussions about the technology that you work on. So don't just read the stuff that's like, yeah, AI is great and all this sort of stuff. Read some of these more critical texts. Read some of read some articles of where people are worried about, to understand what people are worried about in the tech. Maybe there are spaces there that where you can clear up some of these conceptual muddles and try to explain things in a way to people around you even. Also, I mean, obviously joining a professional organization, I can't remember who it was that was talking about it, but there's whoever, I think it might have been Darren. Was it Darren talking about professional ethics? Basically the codes of ethics and things that our professional organizations have, they can actually protect you to a certain degree in terms of being a benchmark of professionalism, right? So they're not going to be able to necessarily protect you legally, but what you can say is kind of lean on it and say, yes, I can't, perform this work because it's against my professional code of ethics. Unions, I think, also have a really good role to play here as well. There are some unions that are particularly aimed at tech workers. And just generally, I mean, the ability to push back against unethical work. It may be that you're in a situation where you do need that job. And so that, you still may be in a situation where you kind of have to do it. But if you don't take that step to kind of push back, you don't know if there's some wiggle room, right? So you've got to try as much as you can to kind of take that step. Driving in-house change. So an example here is Google. Workers within Google were trying to drive in-house change to prevent development of linking up of Google and weapons manufacturing. It didn't last very long, but they did stymie it for a little bit. Blowing the whistle is always an option, although that can be problematic in other ways. And even things like just if you know someone is a member of a professional organization, you can actually report them if they violate the code of ethics. And certainly with the ACM, with my ACM hat on, there is a very rigorous process that you go through to investigate violations. And ultimately, I think, though, it comes down to you being able to take responsibility for your own work and being proud of the work that you do and knowing that you can sleep at night, knowing that you've done your best to minimize harms and maximize the good. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. So Ian, if we go to the next bullet points, I'll cover them briefly so I have a bit of time for Q&A. So we close the book with a final chapter looking at future directions, which kind of follows on from what Catherine was talking about there, really, things that we can do individually. So it might be engaging with the BCS, looking at some of the frameworks that can help in addressing these ethical dilemmas. The Daniels framework is one we cover in the book, which is one from previous BCS publications and work. So we can give you one framework to this. But a key aspect also in the book is some of the CPD opportunities, both free courses and paid-for courses within the BCS and elsewhere. Okay, thanks, Ian, especially for that in the meeting chat. And I think it's just really being aware that, as Catherine said, with these emerging technologies, we work in industry which is changing all the time. Again, I've seen fast changes in the sort of 3 decades or so I've been active in the industry, and I think we're seeing another step change now with AI. As Catherine mentioned, the potential for quantum in the near future just shows that we have to keep on refreshing our own approaches to how we identify and address the ethical challenges which are around us. Hopefully we can do that in a way which, again, go back to the BCS sort of tagline of making IT good for society. Ethics gives us a way to think about what is good and how can we be a part of that. So thank you everyone for your contributions. It's over to Q&A. I realise we've run bit over in content time, but hopefully that's been informative. So Ian, do you want to use the Q&A function you say, or using chat?
There is one question in the Q&A, basically about whether the book contains a particular ethical framework within it, or is there a common ethical framework people can use? Obviously, we referred to BCS Code of Conduct, ACM Code of Ethics, I take it, and anything else that we could use.
So the evaluation framework was the Diet framework first at the end. That gives you a way to potentially address that. I think we talk earlier on in the book about some of the frameworks available. So things like, obviously, as BCS members, the BCS Code of Conduct, which has ethical aspects to it. Any other contributors want to flag up sort of the ethical frameworks?
So we don't propose a authoritative ethical framework. We do put some references into some of the key ethical theories out there, utilitarianism and deontology and so on. But I think we are on firmly shared ground that we promote implicitly, at least, a sort of ethical pluralism. So we're saying there's not one way of thinking about this. There are many, and we need to understand what they are, rather than saying you have to do X, Y, and Z.
The EU has also made some contributions which we reference and point to. They've got some resources in terms of some of their guidelines and approaches for IT ethics.
And also, if I may, in the chapter on professionalism, there's a set of questions that help to frame how we look at things, moving from the personal to the collective, when we are working together in a group, and the considerations that come into that, and then into the professional. So rather than advocate a particular framing, a particular way of framing things, there's a set of questions that can help you position some of your concerns through, and working through those questions. It's kind of a progressive process, moving, as I said, from the personal to the collective and to the professional, and considering some of the things all the way to, is it keeping you awake at night? Are you comfortable with the situation? Would you like your mother to hear that on the news? So it's a set of questions for framing and for addressing a situation and considering some of the impacts.
And I think sort of in mine as well, I go through my chapter, I go through things to think about if you're working specifically in emerging technologies. So, I mean, yeah, a lot of the, like I said, a lot of the values, the things that we are concerned about remain stable. But I think, the application of that is going to be where, where things change over time. And so yeah, I'm definitely in the pluralist camp there.
Smashing. Thank you very much, everybody. So a little bit more on the book is just here. I popped the link to the book again in the chat, and if you can see in the chat, there's a number of links as well to ACM resources, as well as BCS resources, and to the speakers themselves. So the book is available now. The best route to get it is the BCS bookshop, and I would say that because I'm biased, but there we go. I'm being a bit pluralistic about it. You can also get it from Amazon and other good booksellers, but for now you can get it for the 20% discount using the code AuthorWeb, or you can log in as a BCS member and be able to get it at 25% discount as standard. That leaves me, I know we have another question, but I'm afraid we have run out of time. But do please get involved with the ethics group, and then we can look at it from there onwards. I would just like to thank, finally, Neil, Robert, Bernd, Darren, and Catherine for going through the book with us today, and obviously for Jill for her work on the book in the background. I'd like to thank everybody for attending today, and obviously your good questions and your comments have been very welcome, and look forward to seeing you all at the next author webinar, or whenever you come across BCS again. So yes, have a good rest of the day, and I shall catch up with you all soon. Thank you.
Hey everyone, if you have any questions, do get in touch with us at the Ethics Specialist Group, or email us individually. I've got our LinkedIn profiles in the meeting chat as well. Thank you.
Thank you.